6 months have passed since the cool winds of September raked through the brittle grass of Valley Glen like fingers on old wooden blanket. Yet the fall has not since ended. The same cold breeze, as sharp and bitter as dagger at midnight, still cuts through the piles of shriveled brown bodies that line the streets, and the deep blue hue of the sky has saturated to a shade beyond what any of us could ever dare to comprehend. It is an eternal blue. With the fall had started just most often too, after a hot wet summer that crescended into a clangy thunderous lightning storm. Mama and I were out rocking on the porch step. We had exhausted the day plucking our small orchard nearly before the bare fresh of apples, when the air began to taste of an oncoming rain, and the song of the cicadas swiftly stopped like a spinning record without a needle. We watched and waited until the pitter-patter on the thin roof began, and then the crack of God's whip licked the sky with a scab of light and came down the rest of the water. It was a heavy rain, heavier than any other that summer. Yet, from where we were protected, Mama and I were dried as bones. The cattle, however, were not as fortunate, and while the pigs might have had a field day in the fresh mud, all the other critters of the night were hunkered down as we were, including the chickens from their coop and the dog from the yard. Oi! Bestie had found her way to under Mama's chair after I had spoiled her with the rest of my half-chewed Honeycrisp, and continued that position until we called it a night. Thus ended the last day of summer. When we awoke the following morning, a fresh September morning, neither Mama or myself expected the harsh transition into the fall equinox that awaited for us outside. The sky was now a bright, cheery blue, every drop of rain 6 feet underneath the dew-covered, browning grass, and the trees radiated the same yellow as the sunlight, spun with hints of red like gala apples. We moseyed down on the steps into the yard, taking Bestie with us, and there wasn't any trace of humidity in the air to be found. It was a crisp air, nearly as crinkled as the leaves beneath our boots, and as cool and nippy we had hoped for after the dog days had ended. The dog and other animals felt the same, for old Betsy was throttling. The cows were grazing at what green grass remained, and the chickens were out of their coop. The mud had dried, but didn't stop the pigs from their play. Scattered across our land, we had thought the valley green. We were shedding leaves of maple and ash. The same ones that slapped on were strut. The children kicked them down empty blocks and rode them to school as passengers in their spokes. Despite the breeze that stung like a bumblebee, there were a certain warmth throughout our little town, and as soon as I had bundled myself in that gifted jacket from Mama that hung in our closet since Christmas past, I could feel it too. Thus ended the first day of autumn. The sight that behind us yet following morning was nothing shy of disorientating. In fact, I had mistakenly assumed myself to be drunk on rum when I first noticed the color coming through the window blinds, a blue, nearly purple shade that stretched from across the room like a rug. I had hoped from my slumber in thinking I had slept well in the past morning dew, but still clicking clock swore to me that it was only 6:15. Peering through the window only furthered my suspicions. The sky was a near black, and the sun rising appeared to be setting already. The shrubbery along with the window sill was still alarming, nearly kissed the brown splotches of bare branches. The entire landscape looked as if God had laid in his brush heavy, isolated colors of the auburn twilight, the only day that had just begun. This, in the same way it started, ended the second day of autumn. On the third day, it was just all the days since the darkness of the night was broken by the unrelenting gaze of blue that swept throughout our land, only day by day increasing its saturation. It is as if a sponge has been left to soak in a bucket of paint, and day by day What little hint of orange or yellow remained in that sky slowly rots into a blackish hue. It was not only the sky that rots, however, but the trees, the grasses, and the rest of summer's flora, in their places laced across front backyards alike, warp the dangling vines of gourds of pumpkins that grow far from what God Himself had intended. One such a great squash of the Connecticut fields had by point eclipsed the tire of my 86 Chevy like there were in the moon. It has since engulfed in it. That afternoon was the last of summer's warm breezes clashed against the howling winds of autumn's birthing pains. It was a great storm that rattled the house and shook the trees, dumping a great many leaves into the yard, scattering them about. The continued gusts of wind air struck the windows and rolled some gourds down the hill like oblong bowling balls, and at the surges of power they had caused snap power lines throughout the valley. Glean rendered my CPAP breathing machine useless, and I dare not sleep that night without it. Thus ended the third day of autumn. The morning that followed, I had awoken with a strain in my eyes, though the blinds were closed and all the doors were shut. The house was bathed in a vivid hue of vibrant blue and cold nip of the outside air. I checked the thermostat and was nearly 40 degrees. In a place of a valley of Glean, a temperature like that was chilly was only around Christmas time. Never near that early in the year. My wife had felt it too. She had awoken to a cough, a cold, and I fared my best to remedy her symptoms with piping down a warm mug of coffee, drizzled with honey from the comb. She thanked me for it and sat before the foggy window, bundled in a blanket, until calling me over the note to outstretched vines that had traveled down the lonesome road towards the Valley Glean Square. The gourds were now in the size of terracotta clay jars, and the pumpkins were wide as hay bales. Bent over them like crooked, jagged guardian angels were barons of trees that sped and spread their leaves far and wide. So far that's not even the blade of browning grass saw the sun, and that the yellow spectre too, despite only just having arisen, reared his glistening head for what seemed to only been moments before ducking beneath the horizon again, in that shading of land and pitch black darkness. Thus ended the fourth short day of autumn. The fifth began, and as the fourth had, the sheer scene of cloudiness, autumn sky, and raspy coughing of my wife beside me. She had been gasping for breath all night when we both had finally tuckered out from the restlessness. It seemed that the rest was only a short repetitive. When we both had awoken to the brightness through the window blinds, I had wrongfully assumed their complexion to be a result of the strange colors that emitted from the outside. I was wrong. Her skin was now the shade of duckling, as if she was ill from jaundice, and her shrunken eyes were deeper and richer, tint of the same color, nearly orange. Her hair was falling out in clumps. She had lost a tooth in the night. She gripped me with one hand, coughed in the other. As it trembled, extended the sprinkle red of the yellowed fingers in my eyes. I called Dr. Stampson not 5 minutes later, after bringing poor Mama a glass of cold water, nearly frozen though left on the kitchen counter on the night before. Dr. Sampson answered abruptly, as if expected, informing me that her symptoms before I even uttered a word. My wife, it seems, is not alone to suffer from illness in Valley Glean. However, just for the others, not much was there to change, but let whatever it was simply run its course. For the remainder of the day, Mama sat silently, except for the whispers of Betsy underneath her rocker, and watched as the deep blue seeped into every corner of the sky above, and the orange and brown crept across the ground below. The only hint of the greenery that were seen were those few, very select trees that, for whatever God's reasons, never seemed to shed their leaves, as the evergreens. It was also so that green was a comfort of some strange way to the both of us, though throughout companionship of that tinge was only shortly lived. Before long, The screeching sunset, even earlier on than the arrival the day before, burned every color of the earth, and the deep blue sky above the molten shade of orange, like a courier, and that lives print in the colors, began to bleed out onto the floor. Thus ended the 5th day of autumn. There was a great squealing that had woken up me from my slumber in the morning of the 6th day, and I immediately had clutched the hand of Mamma just to make sure she was all right. It wasn't her. The screaming instead came from outside, beyond the windows of which rich blue light seemed to throw O's into our farmhouse. I had taken my coat from the rack and made a step out to the creaking porch stairs when my slippers slipped into a thick bundling of dried-out leaves, a pile of cracking orange and brown whose colors were far deeper than my foot. I lifted my shoe from its depths, but as I surveyed the rest of the yard, I realized that rather quickly there was no alternative looting, and even entirely our land was coated in fallen leaves, a layer of rustling litter, at least a foot deep. When the squealing came again, this time louder and seemingly closer, I trudged through the browning colors in my pajamas and jacket until I reached the splintering fence which, beyond it, it held the likes of those chickens in their coop, and the cattle and the pigs. Not such creatures stirred any more. Instead, the wailing of the hog, which had woken me, came from beneath the dense pile of leaves. As I brushed him outside to see Clarabelle, our pot-bellied sputter gurgle of blood fell limp against the dead grass beneath her. There were fungus and a great many toadstools producing from her skin all around the patch of the earth. There were budding mushrooms that stuck between the mounds of leaves and the carcass of the cattle who had just grazed there before bare. Clarabelle was always a mama's pig, and I had taken the bell around her neck with me as I plodded back to our home, reluctantly holding its shivering hands, wondering how to break the news to my wife that all the livestock, including our prize pig, were now dead. But there were bigger problems inside. Mama was sitting at the table, a steam from the pipping of the cup of joe rising from her grip. She turned to me and with a faded, cracked smile, and I stopped the cold in my tracks. My wife was orange, and then her thin skin that surrounded her beauty, shrunken eyes was sickly brown. They were the same saturated tone as leaves flustered across the lawn. Immediately I tried to hoist her up to her feet, but her weight nearly snapped between my arms, and she fell back to the seat with another dried cough, and I shook her head to a silent no. I clutched her cold hands in mine. Still holding the bell, she took a deep breath, which was increasingly harder to do as the fall continued, gazed up to me tearily, her lips cracking audibly. I began to weep as she fell to her. Thus ended my 6th day of autumn. I failed the rest of the night, merely sat up in bed and watched all the blackness brighten to blue outside, but was awoken to whatever superior could have clutched by me hideous odor that penetrated my nostrils. The air was thin enough already, but when the stretch had seized me, I gasped and burst into a fit of coughing, and nearly vomited out onto the floor. I grabbed a nearby CPAP machine resting beside my bed and pressed it to my lips, as if it were a gas mask from the Great War. Huffed and puffed, I could, for once in many days, breathe again. Downstairs my wife, or rather the husk of now my dearly departed had left behind, was rotten and withered on that chair in the kitchen. Old Betsy had smiled too, only soft white fur from her coat was now a shade of cinnamon when she whined at Mama's shrilled feet. The mug of coffee was still placed beside her on the table, frozen over as the temperature only grew chillier, and I reached out to touch her brown skin. Her fingers snapped upon the slightest brush of my hand and crumbled to the floor. I gagged to my mask and ran to the other side of the room, where the only comfort to be found was the basket of apples that never made their way into one of Mama's pies. They were all protruded brown and writhing with worms. That afternoon I had called Dr. Stampson again, and after covering all the doors and windows, whatever blue light leaked through, and now it hurt to stare at long periods. The mere color dug into my jaw and rang the drums of my ears. When the doctor finally did answer, he sounded both excitable and terrified, all the same breath. He begged me not to go outside, not to dare smell it. I questioned him why, but he never gave me a cohesive answer. I rambled about the leaves and lungs, and mutual change of oxygen and carbon dioxide, and how the earth itself was shedding. I then asked him why, then. Both of us were still breathing what little air we had, but he didn't know. I did, however. We were the Evergreens. Unfortunately for old Betsy, though, she was not. Before the day was through, that cinnamon-colored fur had completely fallen off like needles on larch, leaving only behind a wrinkling skin of now a balding bitch. Until at last gasp, that has fallen off too. Thus ended the first week of autumn. Before long, despite how grueling it might have seemed, that week became weeks. Halloween came and went, most of the frightening of all of them by the virtue of the season, and those weeks became months. 6 terrible months, so much as we could tell. Those of us dared to step outside, perhaps with no alternative, our eyes covered and bodies wrapped in warmth we had took a throwing as many bodies as we could, manage into a warming bonfires that crackle. Now day and night and along the hills to rid a valley glean of the smell that keeps many of us awake. The ones that remained left on curbs which children no longer walk or ride their bikes, merely steep at the back of the earth to keep the cornstalks and gourds and pumpkins ever growing, their scent so potent that a whiff of wind takes one of Mama's pies and goes to me to gag and cry every time. Everything outside our windows remains frozen in place, just as the fall had been, and we had often collectively contemplate whatever or not the strange season of the valley lingers beyond its borders, especially where it's not yet autumn. The clocks, however, have lost all their purpose of their ticking, and therefore we cannot tell with any certainty whether or not we have reached the winter months as we suspect. As we all know that the days ever grew shorter, some seemingly less than mere hours, what used to be hours. Father Briggs now raves on his pulpit, foaming at the lip, about the end of the days we have found ourselves in. He swears that death's harvest will be plentiful, and that perchance the colors of hell have fallen into the earth, shades of fire and brimstone. It seems that Dr. Sampson believes in his rantings. We pray daily at the warmth of the radiant spring will now fall once lively town of Valley Glen and end in this endless fall. I only feared of inflating the spring buds, what fauna and flora lie in the wake of autumn and winter's chill back to life. Perhaps this eternal autumn is sparing us from whomever else may spring along with it.